Hi everyone and welcome to the Dodo Bird Nerd. It's me, the Dodo Bird Nerd, and in today's Magic the Gathering video, I'm going to be doing a deck tech on Chatterfang Squirrel General. So, without any further ado, let's roll the intro and let's get started. So the first thing that we should go over is what exactly does Chatterfang Squirrel General do? Well, for 2 and a green, he's a 3/3 legendary creature, Squirrel Warrior, with Forest Walk. And if one or more tokens will be created under your control, those tokens, plus not many 1/1 green squirrel creature tokens, are created instead. And you can pay 1 black mana, sacrifice X squirrels, and target creature gets +X/-X until end of turn, which means yes, this is another green-black commander that I am covering on the channel. I mainly enjoy playing green and blue. So the main reason for the green and black commander trend on this channel has mainly been because the last 2 animal tribal commanders have been in the green and black color pair. And because I want to cover those as I have that more zoology slant in terms of my content, then I feel like I should cover the animal tribal commanders, which Chatterfang is another one, and he just happens to be in green and black. Specifically, as you may have guessed by me reading it, this is going to be a squirrel tribal deck tech, if that wasn't already obvious from the fact he makes a bunch of squirrels, and so we're going to be taking advantage of that. Also, we will be taking advantage of that making basically double the tokens except their squirrels ability, with a few more generic make a bunch of token cards, and then they'll also make tribal members. Those other tokens made, though, will tend to end up being more blockers and not really our main attackers, but they're still something we should have for, doing things in this deck. So, as you may have been able to guess, our first category is going to end up being squirrel-related cards, as this is a squirrel tribal commander deck. And so our first set of 3 cards are going to be Deep Forest Hermit, Deranged Hermit, and Drey Keeper. All these are elves, coincidentally enough. So Deep Forest Hermit is 3 green for a 1/1 elf druid. It has Vanishing 3, and so it is only going to stick around for 3 turns. It'll only have 3-time counters, and you remove 1 at the beginning of each of your upkeeps, and when the last one is removed, you get to sacrifice the Deep Forest Hermit. And when it enters the battlefield, you make 4 squirrel tokens, and then all your squirrels get +1/+1. So this is very good in terms of a squirrel tribal deck because it pumps all your stuff and makes 4 more squirrel tokens. And with Chatterfang out, it will actually make 8 squirrel tokens. So that's pretty good. So that's just a good card to run. It's a lord and makes a bunch more tokens for the tribe. Deranged Hermit's next. It's 3 green for a 1/1 elf. With Echo, it's basically to pay the 3 green again the next turn. And he also makes 4 squirrels, and again, pumps all squirrels, not just your squirrels this time, but all squirrels by +1/+1. So, this card is another, basically fills the same role as Deep Forest Hermit, except it tends to stick around longer. However, I will mention that due to this card being on the reserved list, it is a bit up there in terms of the price point. So, for this card, maybe this might be a card you ask your play group in terms of potentially proxying in, or you don't really need to run Deranged Hermit. If you have the option to run Deranged Hermit, though, I would recommend running Deranged Hermit. But if you don't have that option, then this is not a card that you need to run. This would be more for optimizing the squirrel deck, so I thought I would still mention that here, though. And then more recently, we have Drey Keeper from Modern Horizons 2. And this one is 3 black-green, continuing our 5 mana point for a 2/2 elf druid. When it enters the battlefield, it makes only 2 squirrels, but you can pay 3 in a black and give your squirrels +1/+0 and menace until end of turn. And that is repeatable, by the way. So that could potentially close out the game. Very similar to an effect on Squirrel General has a similar enough ability. So that can very easily close out a game with Deranged Hermit, not even Deranged Hermit, just with a bunch of squirrels. He makes squirrels when he enters. He makes 4 squirrels with Chatterfang, and he can very easily close out the game with the Menace ability. So something to keep in mind. Next up is Krosan Beast. It's a 3 and a green for a 1/1, but as long as you have 7 more cards in your bin, it's actually an 8/8. It's a Squirrel Beast. This is just kind of a generic beat stick that's on tribe. And I mean, yeah, you can get Menace with something like the Drey Keeper, but in general, it's just a good generic beat stick for the tribe. Threshold is very easy to get, I will say. Nested Shambler is 1 black for a 1/1 zombie. When it dies, you make a bunch of squirrels equal to its power. Now, there's not going to be a terrible amount of ways to necessarily pump up the Shambler specifically. However, in theory, you could probably, I mean, getting 1 squirrel off of it's not terrible, but if you could get more squirrels off of it, again, that's pretty good. Next up is Nut Collector, which is also a bit up there in the price point. Not as much as, say, Deranged Hermit, however, because it's not reserved. However, it has never been reprinted, and so it's still up there in terms of price. So again, if you have the ability to run it, then do, but again, you don't need to. So it's 5 and a green for a 1/1 druid. To begin your upkeep, you may make a squirrel. Again, pretty good ability, not as good as, say, a Verdant Force in a Sapperling deck, but still a very good card to have. Especially with Chatterfang, you're making 2 squirrels on your upkeep. However, it also has Threshold to give all of your squirrels +2/+2. Again, Threshold is not super hard to get. In my Ayula deck, it doesn't even need to be built around Threshold getting active for something like Grizzly Fate. It just happens most of the time. And so you don't need to worry about running self-mill to get that ability to work. It can just oftentimes happen. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of Nut Collector's ability. Moving on, we have Ravenous Squirrel. So Ravenous Squirrel is a hybrid black-green for a 1/1 squirrel. Whenever you sacrifice an artifact or creature, it gets a +1/+1 counter, and you can pay 3 mana, sacrifice an artifact creature to gain a life and draw a card. So basically, Chatterfang can sacrifice squirrels, and this can make Ravenous Squirrel rather large. Again, it doesn't have any evasion, but it can still potentially do things. And if you need to draw cards, it can be a slightly more expensive Skull Clamp in terms of just cycling through your deck in order to get cards. So pretty good on tribe way to cycle through cards. Scurrid Colony is 1 and a green for a 2/2 Reacher. That gets +2/+2 as long as you control 8 or more lands. This deck is fairly Flyers weak, like weak against Flyers. And so, again, having an early game 2/2 Reacher, maybe not the greatest thing in the world, but it can become a 4/4 Reacher later on. And that's not even including any Lords that you could potentially have, and is on tribe. And so you can potentially pump it up, as I mentioned previously. So just an okay squirrel to have. Squirrel Mob is 1 green for a 2/2 squirrel, and it gets +1/+1 for each other squirrel in the battlefield. Again, kind of a generic beat stick, but you can give it some sort of evasion with this deck. Also, this is a Squirrel 1, which I refer to, basically referring to that 1 cycle, where they get bigger for each of a certain type you control, stuff like Nameless 1 or Heedless 1. And so it's Squirrel version of that, and so it can just get really, really big. So, again, no evasion, but it could still be a very good beat stick, especially with something like a Drey Keeper giving it menace. Could be a potentially good card to have. Next up, we have Squirrel Sovereign, 1 green for 2/2, just pumps up all your squirrels. Just fairly standard. Give all the squirrels a pump. Nothing really too big to write home about, just pump up your token army. Squirrel Wrangler is 2 green for a 2/2 human druid. You can pay 1 green, sack a land to make 2 squirrels, pay 1 green, sack a land, and it gives all your squirrels +1/+1 until end of turn. This is more of a late game mana sink of sorts in this deck, as you're probably going to want those lands early on. This deck has some sorts of ways to ramp, but no ways to really get the lands back from Squirrel Wrangler. So basically, if you have excess lands, you can dump them to Squirrel Wrangler, like play the land and sack it. Maybe not a way to get excess lands out of your hand with something like Tectonic. I think it's Tectonic Edge. Not Tectonic Edge. It's that one card that gives all your lands in your hand cycling. So this isn't necessarily as good as that. However, you can still get rid of extra lands in your hand, and maybe if you want to lean a bit more into getting Threshold active, this can be a better way to do that. And then Toski, 3 and a green for 1/1, can't be countered, legendary squirrel, indestructible, attacks every combat if able, but whatever creature you told does combat damage to a player, you get to draw a card. As this is a go-wide token deck, that can draw you a lot of cards. And so, with that ability to draw a bunch of cards, you can get to your better lords, get a lot more tokens, and just close out the game. So Toski's a very good card in this deck. And then we have Underworld Hermit, 4 black for a 3/3 human peasant. When it enters the battlefield, you make a number of squirrels equal to your devotion to black. Now, there isn't a terrible amount of mono black permanents in this deck. It is a predominantly green deck. However, at the minimum, he's making 2, which isn't terrible. With Chatterfang out, he's making 4, which is also not terrible. And any additional black permanent you have is just going to increase the amount of squirrels you're making. So he's okay to have. Verdant Command is 1 and a green for instant. You get to choose 2. Target player makes 2 tap squirrels. Counter the loyalty ability on a Planeswalker. Exiling cards from a graveyard, exile a card from a graveyard, or target player gains 3 life. So more often than not in this deck, you're definitely making the squirrels, and they're giving them to you, obviously. You're making 4 squirrels with Toski. 2 of them are not tapped, which is important. Could potentially be important. However, you're mainly going to probably be doing that plus countering the loyalty ability, or that plus exiling a card from a graveyard, maybe the one they're about to reanimate. This is not really a card you're not going to do the life gain. This is a very situational card. However, it could still potentially be of some use in the deck. Acorn Harvest is 3 and a green to make 2 squirrels, and you can flush it back for 1 and a green and bolting yourself. It's a decent way to make squirrel tokens, especially with Chatterfang, and so it's not a terrible card to run. Next up, we have Chatter of the Squirrel. It's 1 green for sorcery. You get to make a 1/1 squirrel, and you can flash it back for 1 and green. Pretty good, especially with Chatterfang. Get squirrels out early, all fine and good. Next, we have Chatterstorm. 1 and a green for sorcery. You make a squirrel, but as the name would imply, it has storm. So if you're able to do a bunch of cheap squirrels or other spells, and then cast Chatterstorm, and you have Chatterfang out, you can make a bunch of squirrel tokens, which in theory could end the game the following turn, assuming someone doesn't wipe your board, but it's still a very good card to have in this deck. And then Swarmyard is a land. You could tap it for colorless. You could tap it to regenerate target instant rat, spider, or squirrel. This is a card mainly meant to protect Chatterfang, as he is very likely to be targeted by removal. However, it could also potentially protect some of your more big beaters or lord effects from dying. So, something important to have, I would say. And its recent reprint dropped its price significantly, so that's also something to keep in mind if you want to run this card. Next up is Acorn Catapult. It's 4 mana for an artifact. You can pay 1 and tap it, deal 1 damage to a creature or player, and that creature controller or that player puts a 1/1 squirrel into play. So with this card, what you can theoretically do is you could pay 1, tap it, and effectively sacrifice a squirrel, and with Chatterfang out, make 2 squirrels. That isn't a terrible rate in terms of making 2 tokens. Paying 1, tapping it, sacrificing a creature to make 2 more creatures. It's a significantly worse Marinar for rats. However, it's still a fairly good way to make squirrels in this deck. Then Chitter Spitter is 2 and a green for an artifact. Beginning of your upkeep, you may sacrifice a token. If you do, put an acorn counter on Chitter Spitter. And then squirrels you control get +1/+1 for each acorn counter on Chitter Spitter. And you can pay a green and tap it to make a squirrel, likely to feed the Chitter Spitter. However, again, with Chatterfang out, you actually get to keep one of the squirrels. But this can just go out of control really quickly, making a bunch of squirrel tokens, and more importantly, making your team absolutely massive. The next is Maskwood Nexus, a bit of a weirder tribal effect for this deck, as it's 4 mana for an artifact. It gives all your stuff changeling, and you can pay 3 and tap it to make a shapeshifter token. This is mainly here to, 1, it makes shapeshifter tokens, which you can use with Chatterfang to make more squirrels. Then you can also, with all your non-squirrel tokens you're making, you can make them squirrels, and therefore they are affected by all your effects. And then also, something like Nested Shambler can potentially now be affected again by all your tribal effects and make a bunch more squirrels when it dies. So, now you can sacrifice it to Chatterfang to make a bunch more squirrels. So overall, fairly good card to run in this deck. Man, I'm running Maskwood Nexus in a lot of decks. Like, I added it to Gormuldrak, for example. Like, if I were to make that deck now, I would have put Maskwood Nexus in the deck because it's already running most of the effects in blue and green that do that. Okay, I apologize for the quick cut there, but moving on to our final 2 directly squirrel-related cards. Those are Squirrel Nest and Squirrel Sanctuary. Squirrel Nest is 1 green for an aura enchant land, and then you can, enchant land has tap, create a 1/1 green squirrel creature token. Just a fairly reliable way to make squirrels. With Chatterfang, it becomes make 2 squirrels, which is a fairly good effect. Squirrel Sanctuary is 1 green for enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, make a squirrel, and whenever a non-token creature control dies, you may pay 1 and return to your hand. Now, this may not be activating super often, as you are mainly relying on token creatures. It could still potentially activate several times, and therefore make you several squirrels over the course of a game. So not a bad card for this deck. Moving on to our making more tokens category. Basically, this is the category where you try to find ways to make more tokens. First up, we have Jidiro Jana Nova Frava. So 3 green for a 5/5 legendary creature cat warrior with Forest Walk, and whenever he attacks for blocks, make a 2/2 green cat warrior creature token with Forest Walk. So Chatterfang also has Forest Walk, so he works well with Chatterfang in terms of making it so that the green player at the table is really not going to like you. However, importantly, if you can find a way to make any opponent's land a forest, there's a card that does that in Modern Horizons, for example. Modern Horizons 2, actually. It can make a bunch of forest walking creatures, and with Maskwood Nexus, those are all pumped by your Squirrel Lords. This is a very good card to have in this deck. Next up is Mycoloth. It's 3 green for a 4/4 fungus with Devour 2. But at the end of your upkeep, you make a 1/1 sapling for each +1/+1 counter on Mycoloth. So you can throw a bunch of squirrels to the Mycoloth, and then he'll get really big. However, importantly, he'll make twice that many saplings on your next upkeep, assuming he survives. However, you also make that many squirrel tokens, effectively more than replacing the squirrels you originally pitched to the Mycoloth. This is a very good card in this deck. Then we have Fresh Meat, 3 and a green for an instant. It makes the 3/3 beast for each creature card put into your graveyard from the battlefield this turn. This can help you rebuild your board, because I believe it does count tokens, I believe. However, if you're able to save Chatterfang with something like, I don't know, a Swarmyard, like I mentioned previously, or if you just sacrifice a bunch of creatures to Chatterfang, preemptively sacrificing a bunch of squirrels, and then cast this, you can make a billion beasts and then basically replace every squirrel you sacrificed. This is a very good card in this deck. Next up is Second Harvest. 2 green for an instant, basically doubles all your tokens. And I believe with Chatterfang, this would actually basically triple the amount of squirrels you have instead of doubling. And then any other tokens you have will get additional squirrels. So this can make a bunch of squirrels with Chatterfang out. Very good card in this deck. Azuri's Predation, recently reprinted, 5 green for each creature your opponents control, make a 4/4 beast, and each of them fights. You don't really super care if they survive, because you're also making a bunch of squirrel tokens off the back of that. So you basically cleared away your opponent's board, and then made a bunch of squirrels. That is a very good effect for this deck. Then we have Worm Harvest, 2 in triple hybrid for sorcery, make a bunch of worms for each land card in your graveyard, and you can retrace it. So this is more of if you're discarding cards, discarding lands, you can retrace it to make more worms, which with Chatterfang can make more squirrels effectively. However, again, we have that Squirrel Wrangler, who could sacrifice lands and then potentially keep feeding this Worm Harvest. So maybe a bit slow and not dedicated to a graveyard deck, but still a pretty decent way to make a bunch of squirrel tokens. The last 2 cards we have to make more tokens, we have Vraska Relic Seeker. For a black and a green, you get a 6 loyalty Vraska. +2 makes a pirate with menace. Just very easily makes a pirate and a squirrel with Chatterfang. However, the -3 also works. Destroying target artifact, creature, enchantment, and then you make a treasure. That also makes a squirrel, as the treasure is indeed a token, so that works well with Chatterfang. Then -10, target player's life total becomes 1. While you're probably never getting to that point with this deck, if you do manage to activate that ability though, because you are in a token deck, that's probably going to mean that the game is over for that one player you target with Vraska's ability, because they are very likely not going to be able to block every single one of your squirrels, and so they will very easily lose that last life point that they have, and therefore lose the game. Then we have Feed the Pack. 5 and a green for enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice a non-token creature. If you do, you make a bunch of wolf tokens, where X is sacrifice creature's toughness. So you can sacrifice some of your more creature-based stuff, maybe even your Squirrel Mob, though I doubt that, or maybe your Krosan Beast, and then make a bunch of wolves, and then with that, you can make a bunch of squirrels, which is a fairly decent effect to do in this deck. Then, finally, we have to win the game at some point. I mean, we've made all these tokens, and I've already mentioned some ways to win the game with, like, Vraska, or with some of our lords, like specifically Drey Keeper or Maskwood Nexus. but there are a few other ways, specifically in this deck, to win the game. Now, one of these ways is the obligatory in the green-based token deck, Craterhoof Behemoth. Again, you don't necessarily need to run this card, but if you have it, it's a fairly good way to win with your army of squirrels in this deck. Then there is Skemfar Shadowsage, who for 3 and a black, you get a 2/5 Elf Cleric. So when he enters the battlefield, choose 1. Each opponent loses X life, where X is the greatest number of creatures you control that have a creature type in common, or you can gain X life for the same criteria. Now, this can very easily close out the game if you have enough squirrels, as is a very massive drain effect that affects all of your opponents. And so if you have enough squirrels and it's late enough in the game, this can very easily drain people out, causing you to win the game. Return of the Wild Speaker, 4 and a green for an instant, choose 1. Either draw a bunch of cards, do your squirrels, having big squirrels, something like a Squirrel Mob, or non-human creatures you control just get +3/+3 until their turn, which can potentially end the game. They may not have trample, but you still have a lot of them. Gruesome Fate is effectively basically the exact same effect as Skemfar Shadowsage, however it's a bit more generic. It still hits each opponent, however it's just all equal to all your creatures, not just your tokens. Again, another fairly good way to close out the game if you have a bunch of tokens. Overwhelming Stampede is also a pretty good way to close out the game. While your creatures may be small, even just giving them +3/+3 with Chatterfang and Trample could potentially be enough to close out a game in Commander, just based on the sheer number of them that you have. Grook Cursed Huntsman is another potential way to do it. While he does make 2 wolves, which with Chatterfang makes additionally 2 squirrels, so I could have put him in the creature category, not the creature, in the token category. The -6 ultimate of getting your entire board +3/+3 and trample permanently was a very reasonably to get to ultimate in this deck, especially if you have Maskwood Nexus. You can sacrifice those wolves immediately, and as long as he survives a turn, you can then immediately ult him and just pump your entire board. But he still has other options if you want. So I thought I'd put him here, specifically in the winning the game category instead of in the token category. Next, we have Coat of Arms. Each creature gets +1/+1 for each other creature on the battlefield, which has a creature type with it. Now, I ran a Singor Muldrak because you're immune to the salamanders that you're making, and they can't block your salamanders. So, well, maybe not can't block your salamanders. I mean, if you make their creatures all into salamanders. However, you're probably not going to be as worried as you have gigantic salamanders in that deck, and they can hit you with their gigantic salamanders. So you're just worried basically if they have a token deck. However, in this deck, just due to the sheer amount of tokens that you're making, you can probably get away with it in this without it backfiring on you horribly. Although you're probably playing this on the turn you are going to try to win the game. Maybe play this and then activate Drey Keeper to try to close out the game. But this is definitely more of a win the game on the spot card because, again, there's a very good chance this just backfires on you, which you don't want to have happen. Then you have Obelisk of Urd, 6 mana to convoke it. Oh, you're making so many tokens, you're probably playing 0 for this, or an incredibly small amount. Name a creature type, and then pumps all your creatures of the chosen type by +2/+2. Just a fairly solid Anthem effect for your Squirrel army. Then there is Throne of the God-Pharaoh. For 2 mana, you get a legendary artifact. With at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. So if you weren't able to necessarily win the game with your attacking with your giant army of squirrels, it is theoretically possible that just due to the sheer number of them that you have that are now tapped, you can then win the game through the life drain effect on Throne of the God-Pharaoh. By alternative, it does allow you to basically get a bit of extra chip damage as the game goes on, which could also potentially help you close out a game with Throne of the God-Pharaoh, which makes it a fairly good card to run in this Squirrel tribal deck. And our final 3 winning the game cards are Bastion of Remembrance, which 2 in the black make a human soldier, which also makes a squirrel, and whenever creature control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Basically just a very simple way with Chatterfang to drain people out, because Chatterfang can sacrifice a bunch of squirrels at once, so potentially you could win the game through that. Beastmaster Ascension, fairly easy to activate with an army of squirrels. Basically immediately can give them all +5/+5, which can make them very hard to block, and potentially even close out the game if you have enough of them. And then Sylvan Anthem, green for an enchantment, pumps all your squirrels by +1/+1, and allows you to scry. While it may not be as impactful in terms of closing out the game as something like a Beastmaster Ascension or a Craterhoof Behemoth, you could still pump your board, which could potentially matter depending on how many squirrels you have, but it also allows you to scry, and since it doesn't say non-token off of that, yeah, you can scry a bunch with all the tokens that you're making. So overall, it's a very good card to run in this Chatterfang deck. So what do you think of my Chatterfang Commander deck tech? Let me know in the comments down below. What other cards do you think you would have added to your version of Chatterfang? Let me know in the comments down below. And now I will mention that my next video on this channel will very likely be a D&D Adventures in the Forgotten Realms Commander deck tech, depending on what they have in that set. However, if there is not one in that set that I'm interested in, then it will be the resuming of our Magic the Gathering Taxonomy series. However, if there is one I'm interested in, the video after that will likely be the resuming of the Magic the Gathering Taxonomy series. I thought I would again mention that here. So, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you all next time. Bye!